Good afternoon, everyone. It looks like our numbers of folks logging in are slowing down a little bit. So in the interest of time and not wasting your all's time today, I think we'll go ahead and get started, and I'm sure folks will drop in as they are able. So good afternoon again. I'm Sarah Monge. I'm a public policy officer at the Colorado Health Foundation, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. And thank you so much for joining us on this first webinar in the Reimagining Housing Solutions learning series. We are so grateful that you set aside time for this today, and we truly hope it's an engaging 2 hours for you. As folks continue to join the webinar, we actually invite you to introduce yourself in the chat using the chat feature if you would like, so that folks can get a sense of who all is attending today. We have a wonderful mix of participants from all around the state. And we are so grateful that this is an interest to all of you. So if you feel so inclined, we would love to have you just quickly introduce yourself in the chat. And as you can see on the screen, there's the agenda for our busy 2 hours today. We're really excited about what we have planned for you all. But before we get started, I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank our series sponsors. This has truly been a group effort. You're hearing from me today, but this has been a group effort and lift, and it's been so wonderful to work with an engaged group of sponsors that have been willing to give their time and use their distribution list to reach all of you and to help shape the content of the series. So as you can see on the screen, this group includes Project Moxie, CHAFA, the Colorado Municipal League, Colorado Counties, Inc., Housing Colorado, Enterprise, the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project, and the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. So again, thank you, sponsors. I'm sure you all found this series through one of them, and we are so lucky that they were willing to help us with this for all 6 of the sessions. So as you're aware, today is the first of a 6-part series, and on the screen you can see the dates and the themes for the full Reimagining Housing Solutions series. The series is designed to have each session build upon the next. So we really hope that you all can join us for each one through August. And we know that that's not always possible, but hopefully you or one of your staff members, your colleagues can join us. And they will be recorded and posted. And I'll say that again so folks can hear it, but we do hope that you can join us for all of them. So now just real quick, a few housekeeping items. This is a Zoom webinar, so your cameras have been turned off and you are automatically muted. But please use the chat function, or not the chat function, please use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit any questions. If you're having any technical difficulties hearing speakers or something gets funky with the slides, you can use the chat function to let us know. Behind the scenes, we can work on that. We will be saving a little bit of time at the end of today's presentation for a question and answer period. So as questions come up for you throughout the presentations, if you could use that Q&A function, please feel free to put them in the moment. We aren't going to stop the presentations, but we are collecting those questions. And if we can answer them in real time, we will. If not, they'll be flagged for the end. And we know that there might be too many questions to get to at the end, but we will do our very best to theme them and try to get to each question. And then again, one final housekeeping item. Today's webinar and each one in the series will be recorded and then posted to a website early next week. Each registrant will get a follow-up email early next week with the link to that website, so don't worry about finding it today. And the recordings will be posted, and the presentations, as long as each presenter is comfortable with that, will be recorded. And then you'll get a Zoom invite through email like you did for today, a few weeks ahead of each series session. So don't worry if you don't have that next one for April that hasn't gone out yet. It will in a few weeks, or in a week or two. So with that, before we launch into the presentations, I just wanted to give a very quick introduction to the Colorado Health Foundation. I know some of you might be familiar with the Health Foundation, but we are likely new to quite a few of you, and I find that really exciting, actually, and grateful to get to interact with you today. The Health Foundation is working to bring health within reach for all Coloradans, and we do this by engaging closely with communities across the state. We are a statewide organization, and we do this through investing, policy advocacy, learning, and capacity building. So we really try to use all of those tools to advance our mission and our vision and work with folks all around the state. We also do all of our work with the goal of health equity and improving and advancing health equity and the lives around those, the lives of those around the state who have low income or have had historically less power or privilege. We are a bit of unique at the foundation because we have a dedicated policy team, and policy and advocacy and the policy team are really intertwined with all we do at the foundation. And we work really closely, I'm on the policy team, and we work really closely with our grant making team to help further our strategies and priorities, one of which is affordable housing. And so that is why we are interested in running this series. And specifically, we have a goal internally of reducing the number of households living below 80% area median income and spending 30% of their household income on housing. And we want to increase folks' ability to live a healthy life where they choose in the community of their choice. And we know that's difficult right now in Colorado because of the price of housing. So we feel like this is a truly critical time to work in the affordable housing space, to work with you all, to build partnerships, and to really help the state advance in this area and to help folks be housed and stay housed. We cannot lobby. The Health Foundation is not allowed to lobby, but we engage in all different forms of public policy and advocacy work, including activities like today and helping use our voice and host sessions and bring folks together. We have a voice and a point of view, but we also work to support advocates, and we want to better understand Coloradans all around the state. So we are excited for this series, and we are excited to share some best practices and model policy and be with you all and learn with you all. So enough about the foundation, let's get going. We are going to actually do 2 polls just to get your brains moving and into that housing universe before we move into presentation. So we have 2 Zoom polls, and we really just want to get your take on what is top of mind for you. So this first question, what is the greatest housing concern in your community? We ask for a single choice. We know that's probably really almost impossible, but whichever one really leaps out at you for your community today and is top of mind, please select one and then hit submit. I think as soon as we have a critical mass of answers, they should pop up on the screen so that you all can see. Oh, we have some very close ones. So 32% is the lead of lack of affordable rental housing to meet demand, followed by a tie of lack of workforce and lack of home ownership opportunities. And then the rise in people experiencing homelessness. Thank you all for your answers. And we have one more. What housing solutions would you like to learn more about? Try to select your top 2 or 3. So we gave you a multiple choice on this one. So let's keep it to 2 or 3. I think as soon as we have most of your answers, we can see what you all are most interested in. Oh, well, I'm glad to see that you all are interested in a lot of things. I think if I'm reading it properly, at 50% is increasing housing programs to prevent homelessness. Oh, 58% is increased below market for housing development, followed by more diverse homebuyer assistance programs. So thank you. That was just selfishly, we were really interested to hear from you and know what interests you the most. So thank you for humoring us in that poll. And I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Jen Lopez of Project Moxie to kick off today's presentation. Thank you all again, and please feel free to submit questions in that Q&A box.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks again to the Colorado Health Foundation for sponsoring this series. We've got a lot of diverse folks on, and we're really excited to be with you all today. So I do want to introduce myself a little bit. So I am an affordable housing consultant, and Project Moxie is a small housing consulting firm. We do everything from solutions for the unhoused to workforce housing. We like to work with community to design those solutions. We work in 3 states, and I personally live in Durango, Colorado, and am privileged to do a lot of work in Southwest Colorado. So I certainly have that lens on for some of the things that I talk about if you've seen me speak before. I'm going to go ahead and jump in. One of the things that I think is why we had 300 people show interest in this series and so many of you on today is we've never been here before. So we thought it was really important that we set the stage for the whole series and have a few slides about what is going on, right, with the markets. So we had COVID, right? And COVID is COVID, and we've had a number of impacts from COVID, and the way that it has impacted our housing markets has been extreme. So I want to talk about what 2022 looks like as we hopefully start to move into a different phase of recovery from COVID, right? So we expect to see some income increase this year, maybe 3.5%, 3.3%. Lots of folks are struggling to attract and retain talent in this new marketplace. And we hear this all over the state. Employers are having a hard time recruiting employees. We know housing is a big part of that. We also know that the Federal Reserve is expected to raise interest rates a few times in 2022. I was on a call yesterday talking to a developer in my community, and where we're just about able to make a project work with subsidy, those interest rate increases are going to impact the way we think about our models this year. There could be one potential positive in that we might see a slight downtick or fewer investors with the interest rates going up, but I don't know if it'll be enough to make a difference in what we're seeing. And I'm going to talk about investors in the next slide. Again, Zillow predicts home values will rise by 11% in 2022. The takeaway right now is, right, housing affordability is a key issue, right? Our rental housing markets are trying to stabilize after the pandemic. We know we don't have enough housing inventory. Again, we'll give you some real numbers here in a second. Our supply chains have been disrupted. Prices are skyrocketing for the materials to build housing. Just lots of challenges right now across the continuum in the housing market. Next slide. Let's talk about what's going on in Colorado. I think we have been hit harder than other states because of the desirability of our state in terms of what it has to offer for quality of life. But according to the Housing Task Force, which was a group that was put together by the legislature to come up with ways to invest the ARPA funds in housing solutions, we have about 325,000 new homes needed to get us back up to a balance in our current market. The challenge is that we're typically only building about 40,000 homes a year, right? So that gives you a really good sense of how imbalanced the demand and supply is right now. The good news, the state is looking at historic levels of spending for housing. We've never seen these numbers before. I've been doing this work 22 years, never seen these numbers. However, it's going to be a dent, right? We may produce about 15,000 new units this year with this bump in funding. Yes, so we're grateful. We're so grateful to have Senator Bennett on with us, his team on with us today. We're working closely with our congressional delegation, with our state leaders, local leaders, but we know this is the punchline. Federal and state funding is not enough, right? Local communities have to step in a really more aggressive way if we want to solve solutions at the local level. And so some of the things we're hearing as we work around the state is that communities are looking for ways to create local resources. Understanding that if you want to be innovative and more responsive to the needs in your local community, local resources need to be dedicated to housing. And that finding places to build is going to be huge. So lots of communities are looking at repurposing. We've got some land use challenges when we repurpose existing buildings, and then we're also looking to place development somewhere. And so these are challenges that are real to our local leaders who are with us today, and we want to work with you to help find ways forward to get more housing on the ground. Next slide. Again, I've kind of touched on what's causing this crazy demand issues. Again, COVID impacts, we had people going remote so they could live anywhere, right? So quality of life destinations have seen a huge increase in demand for housing. I was talking to a market analyst this spring on a project, again, in my part of the state, and we were talking about the capture area for the market, and he said, your capture area is national now. And I was like, oh, yes, it is. So lots of, this is what we're seeing, right? People want to live here and they can work remote. Again, we've talked about supply chain issues, and every week it feels like prices are going up. It's really hard to stabilize right now if you're trying to build new housing. Land inventory is different across the state. There are communities we work with on the Eastern Plains that have land, but they don't have infrastructure for that land. We have other places in the state where there may be land available, but it's millions of dollars per acre, so it's just not very realistic to be able to develop housing. Most communities, there's a mismatch between what people are being paid and what the housing market is going for, and that continues. We also have significant shortages of labor to build the housing. And again, we've known this for quite some time. This is not new. It's just exacerbated in this moment in time, but our wages have not kept up with cost of living and cost of housing. Next slide. Talk a little bit about market forces. I spent a few days doing this research, and I found it really helpful and extremely alarming. And again, we're not trying to be negative here, but we want communities to understand how unique this moment is right now in 2022. So last year alone, investors bought nearly 1 in 7 homes sold in America, right? This is the most investor activity we've seen in 2 decades. Investors can be large corporations, they can be local companies, wealthy individuals. The point is they buy and they don't live there, right? Some are looking to flip homes, some are looking to rent them out. We're also seeing that this isn't impacting everyone equally, right? We're seeing our BIPOC communities being hit much harder by this investor activity. And this is probably even more poignant in the Metro Denver area, right? Last year, 30% of homes sales in majority Black neighborhoods were to investors, compared with 12% in other zip codes. So want to point out this is a very alarming trend. Next slide. This slide, there's a lot of information here, but what's scary to me is even in communities where there's production happening, we're concerned that investors are coming in and literally buying up single family homes. So you normally do a subdivision development, you're usually selling to your local community. We're seeing investors come in and scoop up new single family homes. There were 923 homes listed for sale on Zillow in January. That's 40% less than pre-pandemic levels. So again, it's this perfect storm of out of state, even out of nation, investors coming into our markets, taking up a very limited product. We've got a huge backlog in demand, and it's like the worst time ever to try to build in terms of pricing. Cash sales, and I know we've got some realtors on, so I recognize some names, right? Cash is queen or king right now, and if you have cash, you can scoop up these properties. And again, this is a real challenge for our sort of essential workforce, local community members. Next slide. Just a couple other challenges, and again, these challenges, we'll talk about some solutions as we go through the series. So again, it's what we're up against and how we solve for it is the point. But 75% of residential land nationally is zoned for single family. We know this doesn't work anymore. We also know that there's this great mismatch between local politics and dynamics and how zoning decisions are made and what's in the best interest of the broader community. And so, when we did interviews to set up this series, we heard over and over again, could we help local electeds and local leaders come up with strategies to deal with zoning? So we'll be talking about that. Government regulation on other fronts, whether it's government funding or the process to get to a permit, is a challenge. And we've talked about it for a long time. This is the time to be innovative about these things and to find ways to fast track development processes. So hopefully we can be more innovative in the next couple of years. And again, I've already mentioned the shortage of skilled labor in our field. 400,000 jobs are open currently in the construction industry. Next slide, Sarah. Very quickly, terminology is important in this field, and it's changing because of all of these things we just talked about and the extreme pressures most of our community members are feeling around housing. When we say affordable housing in this series, we are talking about housing that for anyone, and it means they don't pay more than 30% of their gross income for rent, mortgage, or utilities. Oftentimes when we say affordable housing, it evokes the image of regulated affordable housing. That's the idea that the state, federal, state, or local government is subsidizing, providing public subsidy to make that housing opportunity happen. And so there will be restrictions on who can access that, or a restriction in how that subsidy is provided in the future. And then we have naturally occurring affordable housing. We call it NOAA, which is in communities, you may still have properties that are market rate, they're affordable by nature. We want to preserve them or have control of those resources for local community members. Next slide. A few more terms. Workforce housing. We hear this more and more and more, right? This is the idea that folks who traditionally could not qualify for public subsidies, and they also can't get into the local market. This is a significant gap in most of Colorado right now, and there's not a lot of resources to fill the gap. Some other terms here as well. I want to point out the term on the right, which our community is using more and more, which is just the concept of below market housing. And it means we just need to be able to subsidize housing below what the market can produce on its own without any interventions or support. And it's a whole continuum of options that we want to be creating. So wanted to share some of those terms with you. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to go a little bit quicker here. Thanks, Matt. This is just every community should have a continuum of housing options. This is a great chart that CHFA, Colorado Housing Finance Authority, put up. Thank you, CHFA, for letting us use it today. But when we talk about the housing continuum moving forward, this is what we're talking about. Next slide. All right, back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Jen, for that helpful information and level setting. And at this time, we're going to turn it over to Mike Washington from the Office of U.S. Senator Michael Bennet. And Mike, I'll let you give yourself more of an introduction, and thank you so much for being here today. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I just want to check, can you actually hear me? Okay, just checking. You know, the virtual world is definitely embarrassed me many times with this. So I'm glad you can hear me. I'm glad I wish I could actually see you all. I can't actually see you all, but I'm okay seeing, you know, the smiling faces of my fellow panelists. This is great. I'm Mike Washington. I'm Senator Bennett's Director of Denver Metro Area Outreach, as well as Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I'm extremely excited to be here to just talk to you guys and share with you the work that we've been doing at the federal level that Project Moxie and specifically Jen Lopez was a part of. And yeah, I'd just like to share with you how Senator Bennett is trying to move forward to address this housing crisis that we're seeing that Jen so articulately laid out here just now. So we can go to the next slide. So sorry about that. So Senator Bennett isn't finding himself anywhere in the state where he's not hearing about the affordability crisis that we're experiencing here in Colorado, just the lack of availability of housing. And this is something that spurred him to say, you know what, I need to talk to the experts in our state about what's going on and what are the federal solutions that we should be pursuing to address these concerns. And so he had us actually reach out to people like Jen Lopez as a co-chair, as well as Kelly Broff from the Metro State University. At the time, she was actually with the Denver Metro Chamber, and Mayor John Suthers. to say, hey, these are some of the experts and major stakeholders that are great at facilitating conversations about this, and how can we bring a bipartisan group of statewide experts with a diversity of expertise to actually help us figure out what the federal government can do to address this housing affordability crisis. We can go to the next slide. And with that, Senator Bennett really wanted to build a strategy that would really figure out a way for us to work together, both public, privately, as well as figuring out a way to really move forward with addressing the crisis, and a way that can actually garner bipartisan support, which is something that is more important now than ever, considering some of the divisions that we've seen and the polarization that we can see in Congress in general, but in the Senate in particular. Go to the next slide. So with this group of stakeholders and policy experts, we were able to come up with a four-pronged approach that was recommended to Senators Bennett and Hickenlooper. And in that approach, the group actually recommended increasing supply, updating our policy approach, housing stability through prevention, and then embracing innovation as the four-pronged approach for addressing the housing crisis that we're seeing here in Colorado, and particularly in the West. So you heard Jen talk about a lot about supply. Supply is the issue that we continue to hear everywhere. That is definitely the issue for Colorado. If anything, it is at the root, and this is why it's the first prong that we talk about and where you're going to see the most bullets. We're really trying to figure out ways in which we can pull more existing property into the affordable and attainable housing market, which this is something that we're really, really focused on, looking at this whole notion of how is it the federal government can actually help local governments figure out this policy balance of the short-term rentals and the accessibility of long-term rentals. This was a big issue, the Airbnbs, the Verbos, all these situations, and the kind of push and pull of, hey, we want to be welcoming to our tourist economy, but not at the risk of causing an additional problem for us to have workforce housing to be able to support these resorts and to support these tourists and serve them. So this is a major thing that we heard consistently, and this is one of the major points that the group was trying to say, that, hey, we really need to focus on this. And we can go to the next slide. Another thing that we were talking about as it relates to increasing supply, and this is a major barrier, is just the cost of construction. Construction costs, due to labor shortages and material shortages, these things are, the cost of these things, fluctuates, but it's mainly going up. It's just getting, more and more difficult. And so this is where we have kind of a cross section between, in terms of the recommendations that are being offered here and the examples, where we see like a cross of, hey, a need for innovation, as well as partnerships, especially as it comes down to, addressing the cost of land and how it is that we acquire land and land banking and things of that nature. And how can the federal government actually assist with land banking and some of the more innovative approaches like modular housing, where homes are, prefabricated in or I should say prefab, not modular, but prefabricated housing, where homes are, effectively manufactured in a factory and then, shipped to the location at a much cheaper price, where things can be, housing can effectively be made in bulk to the extent that you can do that, right? And we can go to the next slide. And I hope I'm not going too fast or too slow. I don't mean to take up a whole lot of time here. When it comes to updating our policy approach, this is something where we routinely hear about, hey, we understand that the federal government loves some accountability. We love to, figure out ways to make sure that people aren't misusing funds. But there's times when these things actually conflict with the overall mission of these programs, where, in other words, where organizations find themselves saying, is the juice worth the squeeze? Like, does it really make sense for us to go through and jump through every federal hoop that we need to provide housing and assistance to people that need it? And so this is a big point that the group stressed, saying, hey, we got to figure out how it is that we can simplify getting resources to organizations and to consumers to be able to make housing more attainable. I should touch on this point as well. Local control is an important, factor here as it relates to anything in Colorado. This is a big thing that we love here in Colorado. And one of the things that just reading the comments there. One of the things that we really heard from folks was this conflict with respect to AMI, area median income, not necessarily being reflective of what people are seeing on the ground, and that the federal government really isn't in the best position to determine effectively what is affordable, which is what AMI is really trying to get at, is saying, hey, this is generally what we think is a person that is going to be cost burden. And what we're saying and what the group was saying is that, hey, Senator Bennett, if you can get the federal government to allow local groups and leaders to actually figure out what that really should be, what that level should be, that would be more reasonable and actually allow us to gain more ground. You can go to the next slide. And a big thing that we heard, this is a big topic of conversation, and one of my favorites, by the way, was about the fact that we're still suffering from the effects of explicit discriminatory policies from the federal government in terms of race. And this is something that we really need to figure out how it is that we're going to address this in a better way, in a way that actually moves the needle. Because there's a question as to, is the federal government doing enough to address the equity issues that continue to persist, especially when you're talking about the disparities in home ownership in particular. And even here in Colorado, we know that while the Black population represents about 4% of the state population, in the last count in time, I forget the actual name of this, but the point in time survey that's done to assess homelessness, we found that Black people actually represent 20% of the homeless population in that point in time survey. Now, that's just people that are visibly homeless, on the streets. That's not necessarily counting those that might be couch surfing or something of that nature, but 20%. Like, that's a substantial issue that we cannot ignore. And this is, what we've been hearing from advocates and people that were actually a part of this strategy group, that this is something that we need to be mindful of because we're still seeing the effects of these things today. We can go to the next slide. So housing stability through prevention, this is a big initiative and something that's really close to Senator Bennett's heart. One of the things that he actually moved forward with and that he's always been an advocate of, is the eviction prevention. And so he actually developed a Eviction Crisis Act of 2021 to be able to address evictions in particular. And this was something that the group doubled down on and said, Senator Bennett has always been on the right side of this, and we need him to stay on this, and that we need to do what we can to prevent people from getting into homelessness, because once people find themselves unhoused, it's a whole nother story in terms of trying to help people get back housed. It's a whole notion of, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And this is something that the group was really stressing, that we need to do what we can to be more thoughtful and more progressive in trying to address these issues instead of being reactive. So I meant proactive. We need to be more proactive is what the group was emphasizing. And as that's something that I grew up with myself. I mean, I remember my first, experience with evictions wasn't with constituents. It was with the sheriff handing me the eviction notice when I was walking home from school when my parents weren't there. And so this is something that's personal to me, but I know it's probably personal to you all too. And so I just want you all to know that this is something that Senator Bennett is most concerned about and trying to take active action on, and has been on this bandwagon. We can go to the next slide. And this is I think I'm probably running up against time, But one of the things that I'll point out here is just the necessity for us to build stability for households over the long term through expanding programs to support housing stability. This piece here was also very important, acknowledging the wealth building potential of housing and why it is that we not only need to focus on for rental and increasing access to rental housing, but the real emphasis on being, okay, thanks, Matt. Really being focused on the opportunity to help people attain wealth and to break some of these what some call generational curses, to be able to break through this I want to say the bounds of poverty, which really kind of stems from not being able to own their own home and spending over 30% of their income on housing. And go to the next slide. And embracing innovation is a major point here. And we had some really strong members of the strategy group that put emphasis on, excuse me, the need for us to embrace innovation and saying, hey, there are a lot of things that are working well. There are a lot of programs that are working well in the federal government, and we appreciate that. But we need to do more. We need to do something different because we're facing different problems. And we're facing problems at a scale that we've not seen, particularly in Colorado, ever before. And this is where, innovation was a really, key component here. And with all of these recommendations that were offered by the group, Senator Bennett and Senator Hickenlooper really took these to heart. And right now we've already gotten busy in trying to figure out how it is that we can address these issues through these solutions. And so right now, Senator Bennett is actually negotiating with his colleagues in Congress, in the Senate in particular, right now, trying to figure out which one of these has the best opportunity to move forward and to have some success, whether it be on its own or in a larger, what we call vehicle, meaning a larger bill that, has a bunch of bills attached to it that has the opportunity of, passing. And so this is something that's definitely close to Senator Bennett, as I've said before, and we're excited about this strategy framework. And I just want to, say thank you again to Jen Lopez and Project Moxie, as well as our other participants that were on that strategy, that the strategy task force, or working group, that may also even be in this, be a part of the audience right now. We thank you all. And if you guys have any other questions about the housing framework, or want to tell us more, give us a piece of your mind as it relates to what it is that Senator Bennett should be focusing on, I'm going to drop some contact information in the chat and look forward to talking to you all. Thank you for your time, and thank you for allowing me to speak with you.
Mike, thank you so much for your time and your energy and your commitment to this work. We really do appreciate it, and for what you shared with us today, and for being so accessible. So thank you again. We're lucky to have you with us here today. We will now move into our next presenter. Again, we'll do question and answers at the end of all three of the presentations. So again, please put those in that Q&A function. I see some popping in, so thank you. We will now move to Jonathan Capelli, who's with the Neighborhood Development Collaborative and Capelli Consulting. And Jonathan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Thanks for organizing this. Thanks, Jen, as well. My name is Jonathan Capelli, and Neighborhood Development Collaborative is a coalition of 19 different affordable housing organizations, all nonprofits, working in Metro Denver, kind of across the housing continuum from homelessness to homeownership. About 25,000 units that they've created over the last 10 or so years, as well as other housing programs as well. And then with Capelli Consulting, it's my colleagues, Mary Coddington and Augustine Remedios, and we do technical assistance sort of across the state on a variety of different things, working with CHAFA. I saw Jeff Owsley on there. So, I need to speak up, it sounds like. Is this better?
There you go. That's a little better. Yeah, if you could stay right there, that'd be great.
All right, my apologies. Next slide, please. So I'm going to try to be quick. Matt, I'm sure you'll have to ping me. I actually started a timer for myself so I can see how late I am. But going to talk about what's happening in Colorado towns and cities, and then kind of move from there to how housing is funded at the state level, how the funds kind of trickle down. What we're seeing this year in terms of ARPA funding and also some legislative initiatives. That's what I'll try to tackle here. Next slide, please. So, kind of putting in perspective some of the pain points that you guys are all feeling and some of what Jen spoke about, I kind of see this as there's a supply-demand cascade that has always existed to some extent. I grew up in Western Colorado out in Rifle, and this cascade of people working in higher income markets, more expensive markets that only be able to afford to live down valley has existed forever. My first jobs I commuted to, first being hitchhiking from Rifle up to Carbondale and then Aspen. So this has happened. You guys are all familiar with this, but it's becoming even more acute. So you have this resort sort of centers, right, that are having that have this housing demand. There's a supply, that little green box under it, but it's insufficient. So that unmet resort demand then sort of moves down valley. Usually it's down the valley, right, because the ski mountains and recreation are higher in altitude. There's local housing demand that sort of gets squished over. The total combination of the local demand plus the unmet resort demand means that there's this gap. So what does that lead to? What you're all seeing in your communities are some vacant jobs, businesses having a really hard time filling new positions, and then also marathon commuters, which has a huge impact on people's quality of life. And then the box I didn't put in there is just folks who are spending more than 50% of their income on housing just to stay near their jobs, or reasonably so. And as Jen noted, that's about 300,000 people across the state. So next slide, please. How are people reacting to this? So cities and towns are seeing this insufficient workforce, unclear path forward to the creation of new housing for that workforce, loss of existing housing stock. Whatever they do have is getting absorbed by short-term rentals, second homeowners, and then also commuters who work in other towns. What have we been seeing folks try to do? Resurrecting housing authorities, or beefing them up existing ones or creating new ones, doing housing needs assessments and just trying to get their heads wrapped around what the problem is and what options are to solve it. Rezoning, enabling ADUs. Haven't seen so many communities or some are enabling ADUs as sort of like that's the only way we can add housing stock, often because of zoning constraints with increasing density, et cetera. And then getting technical assistance. This is a survey from a town that we're working in right now. About 80% of, so if you add the 9% in green plus the 36% plus the 35% and the 14%, that's 80% of employers that see that housing is either the most critical or one of the more serious or moderate sort of problem facing their communities. Next slide, please. And if I end up getting too quiet, Sarah or somebody, please just keep on pinging me. I'll try to speak up. So what has been getting in the way of these initiatives? So there's these overarching impediments, which are funding gaps, again, to why those exist, and financing gaps in a second. Next is sort of local impediments. There's NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyardism, with folks seeing housing as an issue, but not wanting the housing to be anywhere near them. Infrastructure constraints with water and sewage, et cetera. Zoning, some of the single family home sort of proliferation that Jen mentioned earlier. And then finally, there's construction and costs, labor shortages kind of getting in the way. So let's go to the next slide, please. So how are state programs sort of aligned to address these needs? This is a breakdown of DOLA. So Department of Local Affairs has a sub-department called the Department of Housing, so DOLA and DOH, to address some of these issues. The way it breaks down is a lot of the programs are voucher programs, and then some of the programs actually produce new units. So vouchers, right, help people bridge the gap between what they can afford and what the unit actually costs, and then there's funding for new units. So if you look at this, there's private activity bond funded units, there's straight up funded or financed units, there's single family home down payment assistance, et cetera. All that breaks down on the leftmost column. I have down highlighted in the bottom here how this fits into development. So there's 4,353 units or households that are supported through these programs, but there's 2,182 rental units that are actually produced, plus 89, well, and then plus 187 for sale units. So sometimes it can be misleading if you look at the information and say, oh, that this is how many units are being produced. It's actually how many households are being helped. About half of that are these new units. Next slide. DOH came out with a report, Habitat for Humanity, a couple others had a bill, I believe it was last year, the year before, asking them to start producing reports on where the funding goes every year for affordable housing across the state. So the breakdown that just came out maybe a month ago showed that there was, I'm just going to go by percentages, so the third most or the fourth most column, 11.3% went to home ownership, 64% for rental housing, 8% for permanent supportive housing, 15% for transitional housing, and 0.5% for shelters. About $43.7 million altogether invested, and this is 2020. And then on the far rightmost column, you can see how much money per unit was invested to pull this off. And if you talk to a lot of developers, you'll hear them say that they need more, a greater subsidy per unit in order to actually pull off these developments. But next slide. Regionally, most of the housing is built in the Front Range. So 73.6% on the Front Range, 8.6% on the mountain resorts, 7 and then 8 and 2 for the Central Mountain, Western Slope, and Eastern Plains regions, respectively. And next slide, you can see how this looks geographically. So these green dots on the left side of the left figure show where they are, where all the housing investments in 2020 were across the state. The middle is a zoom in on Denver. You can see a high percentage of them are in the Metro Denver area. I think another interesting one is the smaller graphic on the far right, which shows that this is for down payment assistance programs. Down payment assistance often isn't enough in high cost markets to actually let someone get into a home. So these counties are the main counties where down payment assistance actually is available across the state. These are the only counties that had used significant numbers of them over 2020, showing how the gaps are so much higher in these other areas, and they're high there as well. Next slide, please. So how does this all come together to create housing? Next slide. So first, it's important to look at what the costs are. So contrary maybe to popular sort of belief, the materials, so right, actually developing it, the building itself is only 20% plus 9%, so 29% of the total cost. The rest comes from labor, 29% of the cost, 11% for land, and this is actually a slightly old graphic, so labor costs, as you all know, have been increasing, so these pie chart looks a little different now. Regulatory costs could be 10 to 15%, et cetera. So there's a lot that goes into creating housing beyond just the cost of actually building the home itself. Alternative construction is really important, but you can see that these soft costs, is what we call them, outside of the building itself, are a huge carry a huge portion of the total cost of creating housing. But everything is, I was kind of responding to the chat. I think I saw a chat about 3D printing. Okay, next slide, please. So why is subsidy needed? This is an example of our market rate development. Costs $457,000 to build this unit. This is a sample idea or project. Someone purchased it for $482,000, and that leaves $25,000 in profit. There's no subsidy needed. This is for a single family home, 1,600 square feet, market price, although you might be scratching your heads, what market? It's definitely one of the lower cost areas. Next slide. So for below market or affordable housing, you end up getting this huge gap. It still costs the same amount to pull off the project, but depending on whether you target a really low income, 30% AMI, or moderately low income, 60% AMI, you're going to have these $1 million gaps, or multi-million dollar, 8.5 million in this case to 7.6 million. Next slide. So in order to pull off the projects, a whole, what we call the capital stack, is needed in order to be able to afford it. So one of the main subsidizers of housing in the state and actually the whole country is the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, LIHTC. So that program, if you look at the second bar, you have, so actually for the bar for this over the left, market rate apartment, right? 70% of the funding comes from debt. So they're going out to a bank and they're saying, we're going to create some apartments and we're going to have them really expensive. And the bank is like, great, here's all of our money. And, and it gets developed. When you're developing lower income housing, the debt starts to look a little bit different. Banks aren't willing to fund as much because the amount of income they're going to get, because the incomes to the unit rents are lower, it's going to be lower over time. So you end up having these, you can see the purple costs, the purple line and the green line start to get bigger and bigger the further over you go. So yeah, the 4%, the third column here shows only 45% of the funding came from debt. The rest was the state housing tax credit, the low income housing tax credit was 50% together in this case, and et cetera. Next slide. Yeah, it looks like there's an animation there. Fairly obvious, to lower the rent, the more subsidy needed. So here's an actual project that came out in Denver a few years ago. Looks like there's some animations. Yeah, if you could just go through that. Thank you, Matt. At the very bottom, you have the debt, right, from a bank. So that's only 30%. Next, you got 28% from the 4% low-income housing tax credit. Another 15% came from the Colorado tax credit. Then they had needed it, but you still had this gap. So to figure out the rest of it, it gets smaller and smaller, and all these things need to be thrown into the mix to actually make the project pencil out. Actually increases the soft costs, because think of how much time it takes to negotiate each of these, right? But there was a donation from the local jurisdiction. There was a local fund contributed from the municipality, state funds, and then also deferred developer fee. The developer said, we're not even going to take profit this year until the project starts to pencil, so that the project can pull off or get pulled off. So that is an example for a multifamily project. Next slide. So for a for sale project, this is a Habitat for Humanity development in Metro Denver, the Sable Ridge townhome community. Similar sort of stack here with a whole bunch of different funds needed at the very, very top. Local funds were 12% of it in this case, and federal funds were a smaller percentage. And there's also a pretty large contribution from foundations. So you can kind of see how much more complicated it is to actually develop affordable for sale or market rate housing. And a lot of these funds, some of the state funds I was talking about, as well as some federal ones I didn't speak about, and the low income housing tax credit all come together to make it work. Next slide. So what new things are happening at the state level? So there's a current bill right now, the Moderate Affordable Housing Tax Credit. So this increases that state tax credit that I mentioned a few times in the other slides from 10 million to 15 million a year, and also gets rid of its current horizon, and it will extend it to 2034. There was a growth cap prevention bill that probably won't pass right now. I believe is indefinitely delayed or deferred. But that was an interesting one. There's a fair housing unit being established at the state level that is allowing the Attorney General to enforce fair housing laws. There's a Colorado homelessness contribution income tax credit as well, to allow folks outside of enterprise zones. You guys are probably familiar with enterprise zones across the state. If you invest in affordable and permanent supportive housing for those experiencing homelessness, you get a tax credit. So I believe that bill is doing well as well, but hasn't passed yet. And then there's allowing veterans to qualify as a protected class, so that vets aren't experiencing or to discourage housing discrimination against veterans. Next slide. Also, of course, last year there was HB 1271, the Housing Incentives Program, and there's some other initiatives. I mentioned the CHAFA Small Housing Project Technical Assistance Program as well. So all those things are going on. So ARPA, total ARPA funds coming down were 5.7 billion. This was split into two different, multiple tranches actually, but to simplify it, there's a state discretionary funds. There was 3.8 billion. Housing that was earmarked out of it was 400 million. That when you hear the SLFR funds, the state, I'm going to go with the acronym, I'm forgetting it right now, but that was what was earmarked just for affordable housing. And there was a task force. I saw Kathy Alderman on here and a couple others who were on the task force to help figure out what to do with those funds. Then you have local municipalities and counties that were directly given, and you guys all have experienced this, funding for housing. What's interesting, of course, is we don't know what was earmarked out of that 1.1 billion for counties, 550 million for metropolitan cities, et cetera. Thank you, state and local fiscal recovery funds. I don't know why. I appreciate that, Kathy. Why I forgot that one. So it's going to be really interesting to see. As you can see, the majority of the ARPA funds are held within these municipalities. So how you all decide to use them for affordable housing, but for other issues, for other needs as well, is going to have a huge impact on how many units we're actually going to be able to produce. Next slide. So looking at how the ARPA funds, the American Rescue Plan Act funds, are through SLFR were earmarked from this panel. This is sort of the report, a breakdown of the report that they sent out. It's important to note that this is the recommendations. There's going to be a set of bills that are going to come through the legislature, either one or multiple ones, that actually put funding to each of these earmarked categories. But you have 150 million in funding for a revolving loan fund, another 150 for direct nonprofit and local government grants, and then it breaks down to resident-owned communities, middle income access program, et cetera. Unfortunately, supportive housing and transitional housing funding was sort of nixed from it, although there's a goal to fund it through other sources. If we imagine that each of these funds gives about $25,000 per unit, then you can imagine that there's 6,000 units that will come out of the revolving loan fund, another 6,000 or so for the nonprofit and local government grants, maybe 1,000 from the middle income access program, which means 13,000 new units. I heard Jen say 15,000. That could be that's possible as well. What is important to note, though, is that a lot of these programs will pair with existing ones. So it's not necessarily 13 to 15,000 new units. These just might make existing projects pencil out a little bit more. So for instance, the state housing tax credit program is creating is helping lots of projects across the state work, but it's this new increase of $5 million more to the program will actually only increase by the total amount of units by about 250 units a year. Not only that's significant, but to give you an idea, it's really hard to figure out an exact number of how many units are being funded in any given fund because there's double counting, they all stack together, but we're trying to parse it out. This is the best that we have for now. Next slide. I saw Galen's comment. Yes, there's they took out the permanent supportive housing from that with the goal of funding it through other sources. And if Kathy's still on there, she might have some notes for you about where that funding is coming from. Kathy works at the Coalition for the Homeless. Again, there's the bill that they're putting forward, the homelessness tax credit program, which could create more funding as well. So looking at ARPA for local jurisdictions, you get this total local ARPA allocation. I already mentioned so it's 816 million in total if you add the small cities to the metropolitan cities plus 1.1 billion for counties. Initially, there's a lack of clarity about how these funds could be used. But there was in January, there was a final rule that the Treasury Department put out saying this is how you can use it for affordable housing, just so that no one's worried about getting sued. Affordable housing is an eligible use. Building and preserving affordable housing in impacted communities is fine. You can use funds for capital expenditures to build affordable housing. And then finally, the last bullet, the final rule presumes that some populations and groups, basically low to moderate income households, were impacted or disproportionately impacted and therefore are eligible. So hopefully that provides clarity to those of you who are concerned about whether or not you can use ARPA funds in your community to create housing. Next slide. And my last slide, in case people are worried about my time. Oh, it looks like I'm doing okay. So current state of housing, you have, we need 30,000 units per year to close that 300,000 unit gap, right, over 10 years. The existing development right now is about 22.5 thousand affordable units per year. And so that's about 8.5% of that 30,000 units that are actually needed. So not doing so well. So that leaves a gap of 27,000 units. I want to note that that's a huge number, and it does seem unlikely that we'll ever get to that number. But I think it's really, really important for us to have all of our recommendations, all of our thinking about the housing needs, both in your communities and as the state as a whole, in the context of the total need. If you don't know what the total goal is and what the need is, then all of your goals are going to be arbitrary, right? You know, we're going to create 1,000 units this year. Well, is that an impact or not? How much of an impact is that? You have to know what the total need is. So that's why I try to have these numbers in here. So current opportunities to address these needs, right? The SLFR state funds might increase the output by another 3,000, 250 units per year if you divide it out between now and 2026. It's kind of a rough estimate. So 13,000 over 4 years. Local use of ARPA funds, aside from the SLFR funds, might increase that number, but that's up to you for how you choose to use your funds, right? Then there's the state tax credit increasing units, and then if passed, the homelessness tax credit increasing production. So all this comes together well, actually, I'll get to that box in a second. What is an opportunity mitigating sort of situation that's making this more difficult? Well, there's a lot of double counting, like I mentioned, so it's hard to know exactly how well we're doing. Then there's certain communities that will receive funding, but many of you won't be able to actually deploy it effectively because of your land use and regulatory impediments. The unintended consequences of those issues, or intended consequences in some cases. But for communities with sufficiently pro-housing landscape, state funding will still need local support, matches, land, et cetera, to fully close that gap and produce housing. And then I know that Ceci is going to speak about homeownership, so I'll leave that to her. But short, spoiler alert: homeownership is drastically underfunded and remains a huge need. So in summary, we're going to increase these units. We're going to get to, in theory, 6,000 to 7,000 units for this accelerated period, per year for this accelerated period of funding, reducing the gap to 20,000 to 23 units per year. In theory. To maximize the benefits of these opportunities, though, communities are going to need to do the following: A, have local regulatory alignment with your own housing goals. Make sure you don't get in our own way, right? Have a local commitment of the ARPA funds and other funds and other sources to match with the state opportunities. Technical assistance and expertise to actually act on opportunities and know what to do with funding and land when it's available. And finally, have additional funding. I think I saw Kathy mention for services and especially for permanent supportive housing resident services, to make sure that once they're in housing, people actually are supported to move and sort of achieve success. Once you get into a home, that's the first step. The next step to achieving the life that you want for yourself might involve other supports, whether it's mental health or economic. So that's the end of my slides. Hopefully that was helpful, and I think it was okay on time. And yeah, I'll now look at the chats and the Q&A and see what you guys are thinking. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was wonderful and just a wealth of information. And I know that I'll be going back, especially to those last 10 slides, and really trying to continue to understand the funding and the layers that have been added by the ARPA funds. And so thank you. I know this will be a resource that folks will be using. And I'm guessing you'll get quite a few questions, or quite a few will be directed at you at the end. So now I'd like to pivot to Cecia Guadarrama. She's an associate state director at 9 to 5 Colorado, and Cecia is a wonderful partner of the Health Foundation, and I'm sure of many of you. And 9 to 5 does incredible work around the state, and so we're just so grateful that you're joining us today, and look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, everyone. Hey, thanks for joining on a Friday. My name is Cecia. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And like I already said, I'm the co-associate director for 9 to 5 Colorado. Next slide, please. 9 to 5 is a statewide economic justice organization. We work through issue-based advocacy, grassroots organizing, and community education to create system change, usually and most directly by engaging impacted women, particularly women of color, and their families. And I just want to show you a little bit about our model. Our focus is around gender and racial justice. Anything that we do is under the umbrella of economic justice. And we have kind of different buckets of work, workplace justice, where we focus on different issues, including things like equal pay, paid leave in 6 days. As many of you know, we led for a long time having a pathway to paid leave in Colorado, and thank you to voters and the work that was done in partnership with a lot of organizations, we now have a pathway for one of the most progressive paid leave programs in the nation. And we're really excited to continue to work on the implementation phase to make sure that workers that need it the most are able to tap into the program. We work through family and community sustainability, and that's where a lot of our housing work, our climate justice work that we have started here not too long ago focus. And as we all know, issues are all connected together, right? As we talk about development and we talk about housing, we also need to think about climate justice. Denver had the second worst air quality in the world last summer. So we cannot continue to ignore, right, the way that, as we talk about land and housing, the way it's connected to the earth and the way it's connected to our climate justice, and particularly the way that impacts, disproportionate impacts Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. And then we do some work around power building. And so just wanted to kind of lay out what we do for those of y'all who might not know 9 to 5. Next slide, please. So we've talked a lot about, you know, the development, and I think my approach is really thinking about there's different tools to work on housing and addressing the housing crisis, but we cannot ignore, right, the disproportionate impact that this has on communities of color. White Coloradans are far more likely to own a home than non-white Coloradans, according to the Urban Institute. And the wealth of an average Black American is just 10 cents on the dollar. And then when we look at the breakdown by gender, right, that's even worse for women, and particularly for women of color. We know that even though, according to the Gary Community Venture reports, 93% of Black families that have the credit score and income to qualify for a home loan do not move on to purchase a home because they lack the cash needed for their down payment. I saw some conversation in the chat about, you know, the restrictions and all the challenges that folks are still facing towards home ownership. And we know that the data sources of, you know, the lack of opportunities for BIPOC communities really shows us those experiencing homelessness compared to all census data. Next slide, please. We know, as I talked about, when our focus of women of color, they are more likely to be evicted from their homes. A little later, I'm going to talk about why 9 to 5 works on housing. If you've ever read or heard of the book Evicted, we know that in particularly Black women with children were the most vulnerable to face eviction, at least in the state of Wisconsin. And I'll talk about kind of the cycle of all the things that impact women of color. And we know the wealth, right? The wealth and the gap that exists for BIPOC families and individuals in Colorado as they hold less wealth and as they're being rent burdened and facing eviction at a higher rate. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about how we do our work. And, you know, it's not that I disagree with us, you know, making sure that there's tools to develop, but I also want to mention that, you know, after the foreclosure crisis in which my family, like hundreds and thousands of other American families, lost our homes, we had what we call the rise of the renter nation. And even now, right, folks in my generation, home ownership seems so unobtainable and so out of reach. And this is why at 9 to 5, we have focused on working through a multi-pronged community strategy where grassroots community organizing is at the center. And we work through communications, issue-based policy, mostly at the state level, sometimes at the local level, and through legal avenues to make sure that we're strengthening renters' rights and rights for mobile home owners. I'm going to talk a little bit about our work in manufactured home communities or mobile home communities. And I want to name, you know, I saw in the chat that there are a lot of people here outside of the Denver metro area. The housing crisis is not just in Denver. It's not just in the Denver metro region. It's experienced all over Colorado, right? And renters all over the state are rent burdened, whether they live in Denver or they are workers who are working maybe in a wealthier rural area and then commute elsewhere because they cannot afford the rent where they're living. And that's why for us, grassroots organizing has to lead everything. We have to talk to people who are directly impacted. They have the solutions. We have to make sure we are changing our narrative and our messaging about how we think about housing, who we think deserves housing, and how we build housing. And that's why we work on issue-based advocacy. And we have a small eviction legal defense program where we've been able to grow to directly represent tenants, mobile home owners, and even engage in class action lawsuits. We know that sometimes we have limitations of what we can win under the dome, and sometimes we have limitations on what we can win under the court. And just wanted to share how we work. Next slide, please. Why does 9 to 5 work on housing? Why do we think it's a priority? 2/3 of low-wage workers are women. That means they are more likely to be renters. They are more likely to be having to make difficult choices if they are, earning minimum wage, which we all know the cost of living has increased and the wages have not. And they're having to make difficult choices between paying for housing, paying for childcare, paying for medicine, paying for other basic needs. Women in particular facing eviction, as I mentioned before, are one of the highest groups that are vulnerable, particularly women with children and women of color. And we know that there is a really complex conversation to have about domestic violence or abuse. And when women in particular find themselves in that situation, in addition to all of the other complexities that come with that, they often don't have an option of moving elsewhere because they cannot afford to pay for housing on their own, or they cannot find the resource to be housed elsewhere. And this is why we work on housing. Next slide, please. We know that the housing crisis was already a huge issue, not only statewide, but in our nation. And COVID definitely exacerbated the problem. It brought to light what many of us already knew. I don't think any of us, were shocked to see how many people, or maybe we were, how many people were not able to pay their rent, how many people were going to lose their housing because they had 1 or 2 missed checks or pay stubs. And we know that 1 in 5 renters were behind on rent during the pandemic, with Black and Latino renters facing the greatest hardship. 1 in 4 Coloradans are considered rent burden, meaning that they're spending more than 30% of their income on rent or housing alone. 1 in 4 Colorado renters spend more than 50% on their income on housing alone. And I just want us to really think about what this means. COVID didn't create the housing crisis, it just exacerbated. Earlier we heard about the folks who are buying up and who have the opportunity to buy homes. And myself, when I think about buying a home, right, I think of, I'm not competing often with an individual, I'm competing with a corporation, I'm competing with a multi-billion or multi-million company. And I think this is really calling, right? Even though there were eviction moratoriums that kept our folks housed for a couple of months or a couple of weeks, a lot of these folks are still carrying this debt. We did create, right, through ARPA funds or through other funds, emergency funding for rental assistance. And I know maybe we have read and seen articles about, well, the rent is being paid and it's being paid on time. That doesn't mean that people were not behind on rent, that they weren't facing those challenges, and that many may still find themselves in that debt if they haven't been able to find the resources. Next slide, please. Earlier, I talked about how we work through a 3-pronged approach. I want to talk a little bit about one of our members. His name is Bobby. Bobby is one of our members who has fought in the court and has also fought to get and protect and strengthen renters' rights. In 2019, Echelon Management Company, which manages a pretty huge large of properties in the state of Colorado, charged Bobby with late fees for being late on his rent. His base rent was $924. Bobby could not pay on time for 1 month. On day 4, he owed a little bit over $1,000 with the late fees and his rent. Then by day 9, he owed a little bit over $1,200. And at the end of the month, he owed more than $1,500 with all of the fees and the rent that he was behind on. This landlord would not accept any partial payments, would not work with him. And so he fell into a cycle of, eviction and owing these fees. And as a rideshare driver, Bobby just could not catch up with these payments. And this is why they proceeded with an eviction in April of 2019. And we filed a lawsuit. We have been in litigation since 2019, representing Bobby around some of these fees and the egregiousness of the act that, people fall behind on 1 month and can never catch up and can never get in a cycle of eviction. No one wants to be evicted. I hear a lot of sometimes of protections, and when we create protections for renters, the way that they will abuse them. And I just want to name you, when somebody gets a notice to quit, which starts the eviction process, that is something really scary for any family. Nobody wants to find themselves in that situation. Having an eviction on your record is really going to impact your possibilities of finding new housing. And oftentimes, when we read eviction records, or when an eviction is on your record, they don't care to know what happened, right? You're just automatically taken off the list. And this is why, we fought for in the courts. We're still actually currently in litigation for this case. And this is not common, right? Renters like Bobby don't usually get legal representation. They usually don't have somebody who can show up with them to court. This is done through, fortunately in Colorado, increasing some of the legal aid and legal support, but we know that we need more. And I'm going to talk about how this case in particular then grew to statewide protections. Next slide, please. At 9 to 5, we've been leading or co-leading strengthening renters' rights in Colorado. As I talked about, this rise of the renter nation after the foreclosure crisis. In 2016, we did a survey and we wanted to find out 2 things. What was preventing people from finding housing, and what was preventing them from staying in their current housing? We found that application fees was a huge issue. People were applying to multiple places, and obviously with our market, right, folks are not just applying to one place, they're applying to multiple places, and they were paying application fees of up to $100 or more per person. Think about that. If you are a family of 4 or a family of 3 and you have to apply to 4 places or 3 places, and you have to pay $100 per person without any guarantee that you're gonna get that unit, without any response of why you didn't get a call back, you didn't get that unit. And so we put some guidelines in place in Colorado because we didn't have anything at all that talked about regulations when somebody applies to a unit. There's not a cap on the amount, but there's now a definition for what an application fee is. There's some processes in place for, when you don't get a call back or when your application is in process. We also put some guardrails around rental history, how far you can go back on a rental history or on a criminal record history. We know, unfortunately, that in particularly Black and Brown men and Black and Brown communities are impacted by the prison industrial system. And when somebody saw a record, they were automatically written off to even have an opportunity to be housed. We worked on the warranty of habitability, as we heard a lot of our members on the ground facing really severe maintenance issues, lack of hot water, no heat. We live in a state with below 0 degrees. Last week, it was 13 degrees every single day. These are not issues of I don't like the color of my wall, right? These are really severe maintenance issues. And as I said, people are paying a lot of money to be housed. The least thing that we can do is making sure that those units are habitable, that they're safe, and that we're compliant, that landlords are complying with state statute. This past year, we worked in partnership, and all of these wins, right, have been in partnership with other organizations for court reform for eviction protections. The eviction timeline in Colorado is now a little bit longer, and folks have more time to be able to solve their issue before they get to that final signature from a judge and then a sheriff, showing up to their home, evicting them. and limiting on late fees. And so I talked about Bobby's case and kind of that full circle coming, right, of us working on a case and also working through state policy to make sure that Coloradans all across the state have protection. And then one of our biggest priority is overturning the ban on rent control, rent stabilization. I see a lot of, local municipalities on here, and we see this as a tool. Currently, we have a ban on rent stabilization, rent control. What we are working with is to lift that ban so that local municipalities can work on a model that works for them. We understand that maybe something that is going to work in Durango is not going to be the same thing as Arvada or Denver, but we do see this as a need and as a tool. This is what we hear at the door every single time, is rent increases and the amount of rent that people are paying for. Next slide, please. One of our biggest buckets of work is preserving affordable housing through mobile home communities. Mobile home communities are the largest form of unsubsidized affordable housing in the nation and in Colorado. If you have ever been to some rural towns, and I want to ask you, where is the closest mobile home park to you? Do you see it on your way to work? Do you see it on your way to dropping off your kids from school? There's still a lot of stigma attached to mobile home communities. I've grown up and lived in a mobile home community for more than 10 years. And they're like tiny villages, they're communities together. And when you often see a home or a park that is dilapidated and you see the lack of maintenance and infrastructure, that is not a reflection of the residents. The residents own their home, but you have a park landlord who is responsible for maintaining the infrastructure and maintaining the park. And so when you see parks that are dilapidated and a stigma and miseducation is attached to that, it's really for the lack of upkeep by a landlord. It's a unique relationship, right? Because the homeowner owns their home, but they don't own the land. They rent the lot where their home sits. This is one of our members in a park in Jefferson County in the city of Arvada. This park received 3 rent increases during the pandemic, 2 in 2020, 1 of 10%. So I just want us to think about the issues that working class folks are facing. In mobile home communities, there is a huge percentage of Latinos that live in parks in Colorado, a huge percentage of immigrant families, as sometimes mobile homes is their only form to obtain or be a homeowner, or their first option to be a homeowner. We have a lot of folks who are folks on, our communities with disabilities, our senior citizens, families with children. And so I really encourage you to think about what this means. And this is one of the biggest areas where we've organized since 2014. Next slide, please. We've been working on the Mobile Home Park Act reforms and strengthening protections for homeowners through state policy since 2019. So in 2019, 2020, and 2022, this year, we're going to continue our efforts. We have been organizing in parks since 2014. And one of the biggest things I want to make a call to action in this space as we talk about affordable housing and different models of preserving housing, this is one of them. Between July of 2020 through September of 2021, 80 mobile home parks went up for sale. Some of them failed to notify DOLA. 48 of those parks were sold, and only 2 of those were bought by residents themselves. We didn't have an opportunity to purchase guideline or pathway until 2020. And I want us to think about what this means. And I can keep talking more, about our work and mobile home communities and why it's important that we're looking at this as a tool to preserve affordable housing. I'm sure that these numbers have increased since September of last year. And I want to invite you all, this is like my last thing, to a virtual film screening this Sunday at 4 p.m. I'll drop the details in the chat. You will see how this documentary features a park that we organized with in the city of Aurora to fight the displacement and closure of the park for 3 years. And you will see the way that corporate investors are coming into the state and buying up these parks. I want us to, as we talk about solutions, and that is the focus of this, to think about tools that are both short-term, long-term, to get outside of our box and to think about, yes, the way that homeownership and access to homeownership fits into a model and the way we need to keep working on how it disproportionately impacts BIPOC communities. And also for us, our focus has been strengthening rights for renters, as we know that that is a growing population in our state, and the protections that we need to strengthen for renters and for mobile home owners. I'll drop the information. I put a timer for myself, the information for the film screening in the chat and my information there. So thank you so much for being here, and I'll pass it over to Jen.
That was so good, Cecia. Thank you so much for being with us today. So that was a lot of information. We have questions both in the chat and in the Q&A. What I'm going to do is facilitate some, or I'm going to work with the panel to see if we can answer some of the questions in the Q&A right now. If you have a question, go ahead and put it in the Q&A and we will try to get to it. Some of these are going to be quick answers. Some of these we cannot answer, and some of these we'll make some sausage. We'll make some collective answers. So I'm going to start with the housing choice vouchers, and Jonathan, I might want you to back me up here. So we have a question about, how housing choice vouchers are so far below market rents in Denver, right? And is there something that can be done to increase standard rents in Colorado? So there are processes to increase the rent payments for vouchers, but I want to just make this global statement that the federal government is so far behind in housing policy, and we're funding one out of 5 families that need rent assistance right now, that the big play here is to get the federal government to provide much more subsidy in the short term, right? And we've seen this with the pandemic. We've had to provide a lot more resources because of what's happening for folks. So I think that's part of the solution. I think land use and we're short 27,000 units a year. That's impacting rent levels. So it's all kind of combined. But Jonathan, do you want to add, since Denver's kind of your market, your thoughts about that question?
I think you basically, excuse me, nailed it. There's it's not decided by local jurisdictions, decided by HUD, and the way they calculate it, I believe for Denver is out larger than just Denver, so it includes the surrounding area, which brings down their calculation for what the market rent is. So to change that, you change how HUD works, which is notoriously difficult. I'm not sure if there's any initiatives to do that. I'm sure there are. Maybe the National Low Income Housing Coalition and others, they're working at the federal level to change that. But I'll do some research to see if I can come up with any specific initiatives, things that can be signed on to or supported, because that's definitely a need.
Thank you, Jonathan. And then I'll just also add, in future sessions, we'll be talking in more detail about policy and housing policy and how it works at the local, state, and federal level. And so this will probably come up again. And we had Bennett's staff on earlier. There was a huge push to increase funding for vouchers that have been historically underfunded, and we didn't get there. Bipartisan, we weren't able to get there, but I sure hope it comes up again, because we sure need those resources. The next one is mortgage interest. Eva is our friend in Durango. I'm going to give this a short answer, and then again, I want to see if other panelists want to add in. And actually, Ceci, did you want to respond to the Section 8 question at all?
No, I'm okay. I mean, I would just say, that I do think, so we don't organize in tenants with like in Section 8 or public housing, but at 9 to 5, we believe, right, that is like what we should focus on and work on is options for public housing and community controlled land. Obviously, like we also want to make sure that at times we've had our own like concerns and questions around like the relationship sometimes that residents have with housing authorities and the questions that they have, right? As they're not a corporate entity, they're not a corporate landlord. And I know that like the mission is to keep them housed and to create systems where residents, because it is public housing, like how can residents themselves also have a say and having a model where there is better communication and the focus is not on displacing people and making sure that those units are habitable, that they are the prime example, right, of when we fight for renters' rights of like what should be followed.
Beautiful, thanks, Cecia. So I would have answered this mortgage interest question differently 15 years ago. right? So what's challenging, so the question about with mortgage interest rising, it's going to make it more challenging. It's going to push more people out that we want to serve. You know, is there any conversations around lending innovations? If the interest rates were 6%, I'd say, oh yeah, we're going to go after 2% money, right? But interest rates are 3.5%, you know, so the interest rates are going up, but they're still historically low, right? So I don't know that, you know, certainly we can play around with vehicles and mechanisms to bring interest rates down, but I don't think that's going to be the gap filler. And I want Jonathan to answer this one because you're making an awesome face, Jonathan. I think that the gap filler is going to continue to be like a silent second mortgage, a land trust model. It's going to be taking out massive chunks of the cost of that housing because there's too big of a gap now. Does that make sense to everybody? So if we're trying to help somebody buy a $200,000 home and in the open market it's 350, the interest rate's not going to get us there, right? And so we're going to have other mechanisms, you know, you pull out the land cost, so that house is now 250 instead of 350, things like that. So the gaps are just really, really big right now. So I don't know if anybody on the panel wants to augment that. All right, I'm going to keep going. Can we see all panelists instead of the Q&A? I think that's, thanks, great, Don, thank you, great suggestion. And I apologize, I'm having trouble with my screen seeing the Q&A. Let me see here. Kathleen, I might have to have her, Sarah, I might have to have somebody read the next, it's like my computer's making all the words too fuzzy, apologize.
Jen, I've got another one here I can read off. So we
Thank you.
have a question that was asked earlier in the presentation from Cindy. It says housing vouchers are so far below the market.
We got that one, Matt, that was the first one we did, sorry.
Going on, please address sustainable development, especially in regards to water. So without smart water management, and I don't mean taking it from San Luis Valley or the Western Slope, but development is just not sustainable.
So I've been thinking a lot about this one because I'm trying to get to what the question is. So I'm going to need help from panelists, but I will say that in our world, when we work on below market housing, we do everything we can usually around energy efficiency, which includes where we site housing, right? So we do infill, we do redevelopment, we do all these things. One, because it's the right thing to do. Two, because we recognize that people we're trying to serve, you know, don't need additional transportation costs on top of the housing costs, and for a number of other reasons. But I feel like this question might be about something different, like about growth, and that. So I'm not really sure. And if it is about growth, we will be talking about smart growth, no growth, all of those things when we talk about building public will and kind of a community understanding around housing in a future session. But Jonathan or Cecia?
Were you gonna say something, Sarah?
Oh no, I was just going to say thank you for bringing that up, and we can make sure we fold it into future sessions for some model policy ideas too. And
yeah,
go ahead, Jonathan.
So yeah, as far if that question was about sustainability in terms of the environment, yeah, huge acute needs. There's a community that we've been working in that has just a couple hundred, I think, water taps left, essentially, and they're saying, what should we do with the remaining growth? It's not how much land we have, it's how much water we have left. So whether it's water efficiency or energy efficiency, especially if it's energy efficiency, that also reduces costs in the long run. So that's really important. Actually, one of the projects that I showed earlier, one of the little bars in the capital stack was a solar tax credit for one of those properties. So that can be part of it, but the funding is needed, right? Because it increases the cost up front, even if you can make the case that it decreases it long term. So it has to be funded appropriately. A danger is that, let's say you have a housing market where you're producing, not in theory, just what's happening. There's lots of units being produced, right? And then because affordable housing is sort of maybe there's a lot of conversation about it. It's like, okay, this needs to be sustainable. And it's like, certainly does. So does everything. It all needs sustainable. We have to have a sustainability sort of program that addresses all the housing, including the housing that's doing the majority of the damage, the huge homes that have no one living in them for long periods of time. Sometimes that concern with the overall impact of the built environment on the environment ends up getting held by the organizations that are doing low-income affordable housing that have the lowest sort of margins to deal with in the first place. So it's really, really important, because often you need to maybe waive tap fees in order to pencil a project off, out. But again, we all super care about the environment, and I live in Boulder right now. We saw the fires coming down 2 years in a row. Like, it's extremely important. Not trying to dismiss it. Funding needs to accompany it in order to pull it off, and we look at it sort of sector wide, because they can tell you affordable housing being built is not causing the sustainability issues that we're facing at the state. But I think it's extremely important to have sustainability in every project.
Dan, I can read you another question if that's helpful. Lisa says, I know we're always talking about building more housing units. I'm curious if there's any conversations about policies to disincentivize homeowners from turning their homes into short-term rentals. An overwhelming amount of houses in Colorado are not occupied full-time, or long-term renters are being evicted to turn homes into short-term rentals. Just curious if there's any statewide advocacy on this issue instead of just focusing on building.
This is a fabulous question. I don't know if there's a statewide movement. I know that there's local communities, right? Like, I think Crested Butte has been really active in short-term rental policies. Durango has some stuff in the books. Ceci or Jonathan, do you have any examples you want to share or are aware of? That's okay. Jonathan, you probably are. And so there's a couple ways we're seeing it happen, right? So it can be a local community limits permits or licenses for rentals, short-term rentals. That they can tax them differently. They can flip it and create incentives for local units to be opened up to the local community. So I think it's a whole new space, and it's definitely on our radar to investigate and bring some of those ideas to the policy session, if that's helpful. And we'll look in and see if there's anything, Jonathan, happening statewide that we may not be aware of. It's a great question.
Jen, can I just add, this is something I forgot to mention earlier. I do think, yes, I agree. As we're talking about building out, vacancy rates are real, right? And that's a thing. And I think other cities and other states, we've seen models around restrictions or guidelines, right? Around funding and penalties around these vacancy rates, right? Because there are, at least in the Denver metro area, I think this might be a different environment or scenario for rural communities, but in the Denver metro area, it's not that there aren't units. There's a bunch of units sitting there empty, but people can't afford to live in them, right? And so I think also thinking of kind of those pieces, both how does that work in rural communities where yes, there is space to build out, but then in urban metro areas where we do have development, we do have buildings that are sitting with apartments and units that are empty. What are the guidelines that we're thinking and restrictions that we're thinking about that? Because I do think sometimes I don't see a lot of current data on vacancy rates and what that means. Especially in the Denver metro area, where it's not necessarily more about continuing to build out, but we do have housing, it's just sitting there empty.
Thank you. It's a great point. I think we're kind of maturing into a whole different level in the crisis in Colorado, and I think we've got a little bit more maturity in the policy space, and I'm excited, right, to see how we co-create some new solutions around this, because we haven't done a ton of policy to try to address these issues. So Sarah, you want to give us another one? Or Jonathan, did you want to add anything?
Sure. Jonathan, do you want to add anything before we move on?
Yes, yeah, maybe just briefly, there's naturally occurring affordable housing, as the term is often used, NOAA, describing properties that don't have any subsidy in them that are, that happen to be affordable for whatever reason. And there's a huge initiative at the state level to try and preserve these units for affordable housing. And so it's that kind of is part of the conversation about how you get, and apologies, I had to jump off. Mike was the one that said he for solve technical issues, it ended up being me. So I got kicked off a couple times. So I can't see any of these questions. I lost it all. So it's just what I'm hearing. So there's this need to find a way to preserve those units and get them into people's hands who need to have a more affordable sort of price point. The incentives for that are difficult. One way that people have been working on it, because it's really difficult to convince a homeowner who has housing as an investment to try and sell lower. One way of getting around that is to try to find organizations, whether it's land trusts or nonprofits or other entities, to buy that at more or less to market rate, and then find a way to subsidize when they resell it or rent it to someone who's lower income. So that's one way to do it, but you have to have a lot of funds to acquire and compete in the market in the first place. But in some ways, an organization might be better suited to do that than a lower income person who comes and says, can you please just give me a little more time to get my financing together or sell it at this rate? It's really, really difficult. But I think it's a really important, issue where we're hemorrhaging what remaining affordable homes that we have. And most folks are going to lose to the market, including folks who are not lower income. Like everyone's having difficulty getting housing. Sorry, I'll stop there.
No, that's great. Thank you. And there are some good examples being put in the chat right now. So I would urge folks to look at those resources that are being put there. Jonathan, this is a question I think for both you and Jen, but it says, Jonathan made a great point about addressing total need. Colorado needs 30,000 units per year to close its 300,000 gap in 10 years. There are many opportunities for local housing initiatives underway. How are we tracking this effort statewide? Are there supports, programs, incentives out there to help city, county, and state join efforts together?
Jonathan, this can be fun. Yeah, I've been thinking about this because I saw that question about 20 minutes ago. So I'm going to start, but I would love, Jonathan, for you to jump into. So I think, we have a Department of Local Affairs at the state, and they've seen such a significant increase in resources in all of their departments that they are rolling out stuff all the time, I think. In fact, I know we've got members from CHAFA, we've got some other state agencies on. So I think there's a lot of things coming out right now. I do think it's really hard to keep track of what's going on. So I don't think we're there yet. I would like to say that one of the goals of this series is to start collecting best practices. I know CML, CCI, all of our sponsors are in one way or another collecting information about what's happening. And so hopefully by the end of the series, maybe we'll have a couple places where we can park best practices information or be able to go back to one of our state agencies and ask them to help us track. It's a great question. And in prepping for the series, there was nowhere we could go to figure this out. So go ahead, Jonathan or Cecia.
If Cecia wants to go first, I was just mentioning to Sarah in the chat, I'm having sound issues. If someone could post that question in the chat, then I can respond appropriately. Sorry. All I heard was tracking. So
sorry, Jonathan, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? It's in the chat right now. Can you see it?
Oh,
not the Q&A chat, but over to the main chat.
Oh, okay. There are many. Great point about addressing the total. Okay. Opportunities for local housing initiatives. How we track. Okay, 1 second. Sorry, everyone. Okay. So this DOLA report was the first step at trying to figure out how to track the funds. And it needed enabling legislation. I don't know if any folks from DOLA are on the call, but they couldn't really do it on their own for a variety of reasons. And now we know what DOLA is doing, but not every project has DOLA funding in it. And so there's Beth Truby, actually, I know she mentioned some of the programs that she's doing. There's an initiative to try to figure out how to have all the CHAFA funded, so the tax credit funded projects, and all the DOLA DOH funded projects, and have a single database so you kind of know what's going on. But it still might miss projects that don't have that funding. So huge need is basically the answer. Okay, your question is how are we tracking? We're not really tracking other than Beth Truby's work through the CHAFA program. But there's, I know CU Futures Center and a couple other organizations have been trying to get at this number for a while, including us at NDC, and we'll let you guys know when we figure it out.
Thank you. There's a question about why not reform down payment assistance, subsidized housing programs, and other programs that were meant to help working class folks with ITIN, especially because we have a worker shortage.
That's a really, so I started my career in mortgages, and I do think there's some innovation. There's always innovation that could be had. And again, we can get you more details. But I'm going to keep coming back to affordability. So even if we could come up with more creative underwriting for your mortgage, or you know, just like a special product, I still think we're trying to solve for what people make and what's on the market if we want to scale things. I will say this, that I think there's a huge uptick and increase in employers providing funds for mortgages. And it's a kind of a sticky wicket. I think it's a really interesting idea. Ceci, you'll love this. So we'll get the employer to help with the down payment, but they can't control if the worker leaves, right? So it's kind of an interesting dynamic. But I would recommend to the person that asked that question, there's some CDFIs around the state that have special mortgage products, and I know they don't, you know, they don't cover all the needs right now, but there are some interesting things out there, and we should certainly look at what's already out there to figure out what we still need.
And yeah, I just want to like lift up, thank you. I think it was Miguel who posed the question that, you know, our membership, for our membership, there are a lot of folks who, you know, are undocumented or lived in a mixed status home where maybe somebody might have permanent like legal immigration status in the nation, and someone has maybe something temporary and someone doesn't have anything. And so I do think we need to, as we work on housing and prioritize housing, continuing to create tools where mixed status families and undocumented folks can benefit from, right? I myself as a DACA recipient always have extra questions of like, if I were to buy a home, what does that mean for me? Because I know it's not the same thing as my friends who are citizens in this country. And so, and that's why in like, for example, in mobile home parks, that's kind of one tool and one form of housing that a lot of immigrant families go to as their first option, because so many other options are so restrictive or so much more expensive, right? If you have an ITIN number, everything increases for you. And when you thought something was going to be accessible and affordable, but then you don't have a social security number, then, you know, you run into an issue. And as we talked about, even the relief that came as we were in a pandemic, we were carving undocumented workers and ITIN workers out, right? We said, yes, but not for you. And we had to fight for things like that. Yeah. We had to fight for families who have children who were born in this country, to make sure that that aid and that relief was also for them, to make sure rental assistance and all the other funds were there. A lot of our workers, right, in rural communities, like, let's be really honest, who's working in these ski resorts, who are the construction workers that are building these cities, but then don't have access to the tools that, you know, we're saying we're expanding and we're providing. So I really appreciate that. And I don't have the answer, but I think that in any model we think about, we need to think of like, how do we not carve workers out? How do we not carve undocumented folks, or carve out families with mixed status immigration in this country?
There's a possible opportunity to work on this now. So First Bank is the only bank that I know of right now that does that in Colorado, that accepts ITINs. But Bank of the West is being acquired by BMO Harris, a pretty large bank. I think there's 73 branches across the state right now. And then let's see, it's not Bank of America. Bank of America, Bank of the West. I'll put the full list in once I look at my notes. But a lot of these banks are doing acquisitions or mergers right now, and an organization called NCRC, the National Reinvestment Coalition, is negotiating CBA, so community benefit agreements, for these banks as they figure out how to pivot to serve the community better. So there's an interesting opportunity for advocacy with a lot of these banks to say, we need, among other things, you need to accept ITINs and have more accessible homeownership products. And it's kind of unusual to have opportunities to interface directly with banks like that, but it kind of exists now. So if folks are interested in getting involved in that conversation, I'm happy to plug them in.
One other comment, this is so good. I misunderstood the question. I am so sorry. I think it's important as we go through this series and other conversations that we're keeping track of what doesn't exist, right? Because if we don't ask for funds for stuff that doesn't exist now, when are we going to do that? So it's a great opportunity, I think, Cecia, for the community to say, hey, these are some things that we don't see readily available, and we'd like to control some of these resources, right? Thank you.
And there's a couple comments in the Q&A that Elevation Community Land Trust works with people with ITIN, but they have to have a 5% down payment and self-employed. And Habitat for Humanity also works with ITIN. So just want to raise awareness. And then in the chat, there are some great points around USDA loans and it's been an especially useful tool in rural areas. So it's definitely something we want to lift up and continue to see movement on. So the last question that's in here is around a task force working on affordable supportive housing for people living with cognitive disabilities. There's another question further up around ARPA funds being able to be used for those living with disabilities, including intellectual and developmental disabilities, as they often get left out and tend to be under the 30% AMI. And I just want to thank folks for lifting up this population and something that we want to be aware of and make sure that we are incorporating into our policies. I don't have direct answers. Jen or Jonathan or Cecia, anything you'd like to add?
I think these are great questions, and I am not aware, and again, I'm not an expert on all the things happening at the state, but I will say I'm not aware of any formal task force, and there should be one. So, yeah.
When it comes to folks with developmental disabilities and mental health issues, there was the SLFR task force on behavioral health that happened simultaneously with the housing task force. They were given $450 million. And so those recommendations, I can see it's fairly easy to look up SLFR behavioral health task force recommendations. You can see kind of what's going on, what the recommendations are there. But it was interesting, a lot of the housing programs that didn't get through their SLFR funds, services and behavioral health funding, the idea was that the behavioral health task force would create funds that could kind of flow between and help local governments and nonprofits in that way as well. So there was a slight silo breakdown that happened. Of course, those are just recommendations, and actually has to turn into legislation. We'll see how well they actually mesh. Sarah says some of them might come together as joint legislation later in the session. Exactly. So hopefully that's what happens, and we'll have to stay tuned for that.
So those are all the questions that I can see. I don't know, Matt or Kathleen, if I've missed any as I'm trying to scroll through at the same time, or Jen, if there's anything you'd like to elaborate on. This has been really great engagement, and we thank you all for being so engaged with us today. And again, especially that chat. So we are definitely going to make sure that the chat stays with the recording and copy and paste it and pull with the resources. And we're so grateful for your time, for our presenters' time today. This has been a rich conversation. This is just one of 6, so I think there's much more to come. But Jen, any closing comments from you as you look forward to the next 5?
Yeah, just that thank you. And we are looking for ideas, best practices, model policies, diverse voices, different opinions. We're making up the series as we go. So please reach out to us if you've got some things that you think need to be on our radar that we're not aware of. Other than that, we're just grateful to have this conversation. And Cecia, Jonathan, and Mike were fantastic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, presenters, and thank you everyone for your time today, and have a fabulous rest of your Friday and weekend. And again, thanks. We'll see you soon.